Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Anatomy by Dr. Vijaya. Today session will be the last part of neuroanatomy of brainstem, where I'll be covering the external and internal features of midbrain, including the clinical aspects. Let us learn about the features of midbrain. So the internal features of the midbrain we will be learning in two sections, one at the level of the inferior colliculus, the second one at the level of superior colliculus. So in this picture, the blue one represents the midbrain. So you are seeing the anterior lateral surface of the midbrain here, and this is in the sagittal section. So these are called as the peduncles of the midbrain, cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. And the two peduncles, like it looks like a legs. Okay, so cerebral peduncle, the two legs, and it mainly at the median, it encloses a fossa called as Interpedicular Fossa. The name only tells that this fossa is between the two peduncles of the midbrain. So that's why it's named as Interpedicular Fossa. So this is the anterior part of the midbrain, and here you can see the posterior part. So between these two, the posterior and the anterior, so anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3, so it is separated by a cavity. So the cavity enclosed by the midbrain is called as cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. So the aqueduct of Sylvius or cerebral aqueduct separates the midbrain into two parts. The one which is lying anteriorly will be called as cerebral peduncles, and the part which is lying posterior to the cerebral aqueduct will be called as tectum. Okay, so the aqueduct divides the midbrain into two parts. So here you can see these are the peduncles. So mainly this is that part of the peduncle. Again, peduncle is subdivided into two areas. So this is called as the crus cerebri. Okay, and this fossa enclosed by the between the two peduncles. So this is the interpedicular fossa. So this is optic chiasma. So the optic nerve crosses over to form optic chiasma and then continues as optic tract. Okay, so this is optic tract, this is optic chiasma, and this is the optic nerve. Okay, so and this is the interpedicular fossa. So here you will be seeing tuberculum cinerum. These two swelling are called as mammillary bodies, and here at the center, at the posterior aspect, you can see some small perforation. So these perforations are made by the small vessels which are entering deep. They give deep branches which mainly supplies the nuclei which are deeply present within the brain. So since these are, they look due to the perforation, so this area is called as posterior perforated substance, okay, or posterior perforated area. So this is the one, okay, and on either side you can see the peduncles. On the medial aspect of the peduncle, you can see the rootlets of oculomotor nerve, that is the third cranial nerve, and from the lateral aspect of the peduncle, you will be seeing the emerging of the rootlets of trochlear nerve, which is the fourth cranial nerve. Okay, so medially you see oculomotor, laterally trochlear. So this diagram shows these are the two peduncles. This is the interpedicular fossa having tuber cinerum, mammillary bodies, posterior perforated substance. So medially you are seeing oculomotor nerve, and this is trochlear nerve. So trochlear nerve is thinner, and this is the only cranial nerve which emerges from the posterior aspect. So it comes emerges out from the posterior aspect, winds around, and then it is seen anteriorly. Okay, so laterally it comes laterally and then comes out. So you can see here this is the trochlear nerve emerging from the posterior aspect, then passes lateral to the peduncle, and it is seen on the anterior surface. So this is only the cranial nerve which is seen on the posterior surface of the brain stem. The rest of the cranial nerves which are emerging from the brain stem, they can be seen on the anterior surface. So oculomotor and trochlear On the posterior aspect, okay, so this is the anterior aspect of the midbrain. On the posterior aspect, so you will be seeing, so which is posterior to the aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct. So you will be seeing two pairs of swellings. So those are called as, so totally they make 4 swellings. So that's why they are called as corpora quadrigemina. Okay, quadrigemina means 4. So they are 4 in number. So those are called as, so here you can see, so they are called as superior and inferior colliculi. Okay, so there will be 2 inferior colliculi and 2 superior colliculi. So these are connected to the geniculate bodies present on the posterior part of the thalamus. So thalamus, the posterior end has a pulvinar. Okay, so in the pulvinar region, there are 2 bodies, lateral and medial geniculate body. So these colliculi are really, they are connected to the geniculate bodies which are present in the pulvinar part of the thalamus through a brachium. Okay, so there are 2 brachium here. So one is superior brachium, the other is inferior brachium. So superior colliculus is connected to the lateral geniculate body through superior brachium, and inferior colliculus is connected to the medial geniculate body through inferior brachium. Okay, so these are seen on the posterior aspect of the midbrain. Superior colliculus forms the part of the visual reflex, okay, the visual pathway and the visual reflexes, and inferior colliculus is related to the auditory pathway. So that was about the external features of the midbrain. Now coming to the internal features of the midbrain. So we will be learning in 2 sections. The first section is at the level of inferior colliculus. So before we proceed, I would like to discuss a clinical vignette. A 41-year-old woman was diagnosed as having a lesion in the midbrain. Physical examination revealed an oculomotor nerve palsy on the left side and absence of light and accommodation reflexes on the left side. There was some weakness but no atrophy of the muscles of the lower part of the face and the tongue on the right side. So there was weakness and not complete atrophy, but there was some weakness at the lower part of the face and the tongue on the right side. There was evidence of spastic paralysis of the right arm and leg. So left side there was oculomotor nerve palsy, left side there was absence of light and accommodation reflex, but right side there was weakness at the lower part of the face and tongue, and right arm and leg there was spastic paralysis. So spastic paralysis means it's a kind of upper motor neuron lesion. There was no evidence of any sensory loss on either side of the head, trunk or limbs. So let us gain the knowledge of the neuroanatomy of midbrain, and then we can correlate with this anatomy knowledge and we can correlate with this clinical case. So these are the different clinical condition. So here you can see there is infarction or there is neurological deficit mainly occupying the central gray matter. So this is the cerebral aqueduct. Around the cerebral aqueduct there will be layer of gray matter, central gray matter. So that area is blocked over here. So this here you can see it is mainly occupying the anterior aspect of the midbrain, mainly the crus cerebri. So this part is called as crus cerebri, okay, which is a part of cerebral peduncle. Here this is a condition where it is occupying the lemnisci and also the oculomotor nerve. So this is oculomotor nerve which is emerging out. So here it is, there is a deficit mainly damaging the lemnisci. So all the lemnisci which are present over here. So we will be discussing about that as we go further. So first let us know the normal features, internal features of the midbrain. So each half of the midbrain anterior to the aqueduct, I have already mentioned, is called a cerebral peduncle. So each peduncle, it is again subdivided into 2 parts by substantia nigra. Okay, so this is a pigmented area over there. Okay, so this substantia nigra will subdivide cerebral peduncle into two more parts. The anterior part is called as crus cerebri and the posterior part is called tegmentum. Okay, and the part, as I mentioned, there is central gray matter surrounding the cerebral aqueduct, and the part lying posterior to cerebral aqueduct will be called as tectum, which has 4 colliculi, superior and inferior. So altogether 4 is called as corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so here you can see, so this part is crus cerebri, this is substantia nigra, this is the aqueduct is present here. So the part posterior to the aqueduct here, this part is called as a tectum. Okay, the part over here, so this is substantia nigra, so this part is called as the tegmentum. Okay, so this whole thing is cerebral peduncle. The part which is lying anterior to cerebral aqueduct is called as the peduncle. Again, peduncle is divided by substantia nigra into anterior part crus cerebri and posterior part tegmentum, and the part lying posterior to the cerebral aqueduct will be called as tectum. So midbrain has 3 parts: tectum, tegmentum and crus cerebri. So tegmentum and crus cerebri is a part of cerebral peduncle. So first section at the level of inferior colliculi. So nuclei, definitely it has inferior colliculus located in the tectum part. Then there is substantia nigra. Then there is trochlear nucleus. So at this level you can see the trochlea, the 4th cranial nerve nucleus. Then mesencephalic nuclei of trigeminal nerve. So I have mentioned in my earlier videos, so especially in my part 1, the video on medulla oblongata, I have shown the trigeminal nerve sensory nuclei, how they are distributed throughout the brainstem. So spinal nucleus is present in the medulla oblongata, main sensory nucleus in the pons, and mesencephalic nuclei in the trigeminal nerve. So this nuclei receives first order neuron which are concerned with proprioception, that is mainly the joint sensation from the face. So main joint which is present is the temporomandibular joint. So that proprioception, the jaw movement, so the sensation is mainly conveyed to the mesencephalic nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, which is located in the midbrain. Then motor tracts, same, corticospinal and corticonuclear. Corticospinal which goes to the spinal cord, corticonuclear which goes to the cranial nerve nuclei situated in the pons and medulla oblongata. So along with that there are corticopontine fibers. So there are 2 types, temporopontine and frontopontine. So they are coming from temporal and the frontal lobe. So these are corticopontine fibers which are present in the midbrain. Then they go and relay in the pontine nuclei which is present in the basilar part of the pons. Then from there they form transverse fibers, okay, transverse pontine fibers, which goes to the cerebellum through middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, then it also has medial longitudinal fasciculus. The function I've already mentioned. So this is a group of nerve fibers connecting the nerves of the extraocular muscle, that is 3rd, 4th and 6th. Then vestibulocochlear nerve, and also with the spinal part of accessory nerve which mainly supplies sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. So this mainly controls and coordinates the movements of the head with the eyeball in reaction to the stimulus. Okay, so by hearing, through hearing. The sensory tracts include all the lemnisci. So already you know what are these lemnisci. Medial lemniscus is concerned with conscious proprioception, 2-point discrimination and fine touch. Spinal lemniscus is the lateral and anterior spinothalamic tract, okay, which is carrying pain and temperature from the body, that is from the trunk and the limbs. Then lateral lemniscus is related to the auditory pathway, that is from the trapezoid body and the superior olivary nucleus. The tract formed which ascends will form the lateral lemniscus. Okay, so they have both crossed and uncrossed fibers. Trigeminal lemniscus is those fibers which are grouped together, which are coming from spinal and main sensory nucleus. Okay, so they all group together to form one lemniscus called as trigeminal lemniscus. So they mainly have the fibers which are coming from the spinal nucleus and fibers from the main sensory nucleus. So they all group together to form trigeminal lemniscus. Okay, then you can see the dissociation of superior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, the fibers which are entering the cerebellum from midbrain. So they dissociate, they cross over at this level. So you will be seeing the dissociation of superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, and the cavity enclosed is cerebral aqueduct. So here you can see this is a section at the level of inferior colliculus. So this is the tectum part. So you are seeing the inferior colliculus. So inferior colliculus, it's a part of auditory pathway. This is the cerebral aqueduct. This is a layer of grey matter. So here is the trochlear nucleus. Okay, so the nerve fibers comes out, the axon fibers from the nucleus comes out anterior to the grey matter, then goes lateral, then passes posteriorly, then the fibers cross over here in the superior medullary vellum. Okay, so they cross over and passes lateral to the peduncles. Okay, so then they can be seen on the anterior surface. So this is the trochlear nerve, the only cranial nerve which is present on the, can be seen on the posterior surface of the brain stem. Then you can see the mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve within the grey matter. Okay, then you can see the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Okay, and here you can see the crossing over, the dissociation of superior cerebellar peduncle. So mainly the fibers which are entering the cerebellum. So that is mainly, if you can see, spinocerebellar tract, anterior spinocerebellar tract. So they pass through superior cerebellar peduncle and go to the cerebral hemisphere, cerebellar hemisphere. So here you can see the lemnisci. The medial most will be medial lemniscus, then lateral to medial lemniscus you will be seeing the rest, that is the spinal, then you can see trigeminal lemniscus and the lateral lemniscus. Okay, so all the lemniscus are present over here. The medial most will be medial lemniscus, lateral most will be lateral lemniscus, and in between you will be seeing spinal and trigeminal. Okay, so here is the substantia nigra. So this has the neuronal cell bodies which are pigmented due to the, in the cytoplasm they secrete melanin. So they look dark in color. Okay, on fresh section you can see a dark color pigmented area. So that's the substantia nigra. So this mainly it is concerned with motor function. They mainly control the muscle tone. They are connected to the basal nuclei and also they are connected to the cerebral cortex, hypothalamus, all those areas. So if you can remember the basal nuclei, the dopamine which is secreted, it goes to the basal nuclei, passes through the nerve fibers, passes over there. So they are mainly concerned with the control of muscle tone. Okay, so they are related to the motor movements, okay, the voluntary movements. This is the crus cerebri. Okay, so the middle 2/3, so this part mainly has the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. Medially it has the frontopontine fibers and laterally it has the temporopontine fibers. So mainly the corticospinal and corticonuclear occupies the middle 2/3 of the crus cerebri. And here is the interpedicular fossa. So substantia nigra is a large motor nucleus. Then it is found throughout the midbrain and it mainly has medium sized multipolar neurons containing melanin pigment within their cytoplasm. So they are concerned with muscle tone and they are connected to cerebral cortex, spinal cord, basal nuclei mainly, and to hypothalamus. So mainly whenever there is neuronal degeneration of substantia nigra or the pathway which are connected to the basal nuclei, so that leads to a condition called as Parkinson's disease. Okay. Then inferior colliculus, again it's a large nucleus of grey matter. So as I mentioned earlier, it is the part of the auditory pathway. So they mainly receive the terminal fibers of lateral lemniscus. Okay, and then from inferior they are connected to the medial geniculate body which is present at the pulvinar part of the thalamus through inferior brachium. So from there it goes to the auditory cortex which is located in the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. Next section at the level of superior colliculi. So you will be seeing nuclei, superior colliculus. Again, substantia nigra is present throughout the midbrain. There you will be seeing the oculomotor nucleus. Then you can see Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is the parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve not only supplies the extraocular muscles, which includes superior rectus, medial rectus, then inferior rectus, inferior oblique, so all, and levator palpebrae superioris. So all these extraocular muscles are supplied by oculomotor nerve. Okay, along with that, oculomotor nerve has the parasympathetic innervation, so through Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Just like facial nerve and vagus nerve, so even oculomotor nerve has a parasympathetic innervation. Then you can, beside the superior colliculus, there is one more nucleus called as pretectal nucleus. So these superior and pretectal nucleus are concerned with reflex pathway, that is pupillary light reflex and accommodation reflex. Then you can see a very important nucleus over there, red nucleus, which is concerned with extrapyramidal motor system. So you have two tracts which mainly controls our voluntary movements. One is the pyramidal tract, which is the corticospinal fibers, and there is one more which is called as extrapyramidal tract. So the one of the tract is rubrospinal, so that mainly comes from red nucleus. Then mesencephalic nuclei of trigeminal nerve, they are present in both the section. Motor tract almost same as you see in the inferior colliculi, same here, but here, so inferior colliculus, you had seen the decussation of superior cerebellar peduncle, but here you can see the decussation of rubrospinal tract, which is mainly coming from the red nucleus. So rubrospinal forms a part of extrapyramidal system. Okay, sensory tracts includes all the lemniscus except lateral lemniscus, because lateral lemniscus, they terminate in the inferior colliculus. So no more lateral lemniscus is seen over here because it terminates in the inferior colliculus. So this section is above that, so that's why there is no lateral lemniscus. So only trigeminal, spinal and medial. Cavity is the same, cerebral aqueduct. So here you can see this is a cerebral aqueduct, mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So here anteriorly in this grey matter you will be seeing the nucleus of oculomotor nerve, and here is the superior colliculus. Near to the superior colliculus, this area, it's not shown in this picture, you will be seeing the pretectal nucleus, which are concerned with the reflexes, light reflexes. Then you can also see Edinger-Westphal nucleus here. Okay, so that's not shown in this diagram. This is the red nucleus. Okay, so they have the more iron content and they look reddish on a fresh specimen, on a fresh section. So that's why it's named as red nucleus, and they give rise to rubrospinal tract. So they have connection with the cerebral cortex, and in turn they are connected to the spinal cord, and they form the extrapyramidal system, mainly controlling the voluntary movements. Here is the lemnisci, which you can see here. So doesn't have lateral lemniscus, but rest of the lemnisci are present here, medial, spinal and trigeminal lemniscus. And here you can see the oculomotor nerve, which is the rootlets which are emerging anteriorly and lies medial to the peduncle or the crus cerebri. So superior colliculus, large nucleus of grey matter which is located in the tectum. As I mentioned earlier, it forms a part of the visual reflexes, that is mainly pupillary light reflex. It is connected to the lateral geniculate body through superior brachium. So it mainly receives afferent fibers from optic nerve, visual cortex and spinotectal tract, that is from the spinal cord. So it helps in coordination of the movement according to the reflex. Then efferent fibers from the superior colliculus, the fibers which arise, they form efferent fibers which goes to the spinal cord, which is called as tectospinal. Then tectobulbar, which goes to the other cranial nerve nuclei, which is responsible for reflex movements of eyes, head and neck in response to visual stimuli. Then besides superior colliculus, you also see pretectal nucleus. So this mainly has the afferent pathway for the light reflex, which ends in this nucleus. Okay, and from there, after relaying in this nucleus, the fibers pass to the Eddinga-Westphal nucleus, which is the parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. So I would like to explain this through a picture over here. So here you can see the visual pathway. So what is pupillary light reflex pathway? So whenever light is shown, a torch of light is shown to one of the eye, okay, so the light passes through the optic nerve, then through the optic tract. So they cross over, some fibers cross over, some are uncrossed. So this part is the optic chiasma, then travels to the optic tract, goes to the lateral geniculate body, then they form optic radiation, then goes to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. But some fibers over here, especially which are carrying this reflex, the light reflex, they pass from the optic tract, they directly go into the pretectal nucleus. It's mentioned here, PN is pretectal nucleus. So they are connected to pretectal and superior colliculus. And from there, so if you can see here, this eyeball is the right side. So the light is shown to the right eye, okay. So it travels to the optic nerve, then to the optic tract, then some fibers, they go to the pretectal nucleus and superior colliculus, and from the pretectal nucleus the fibers go both to the Eddinga-Westphal nucleus. So there are two, right and left. So pretectal nucleus, from the right side they send fibers to both right and left Eddinga-Westphal nucleus, and from there, from the Eddinga-Westphal nucleus, the stimulus is carried through oculomotor nerve, okay. So they travel through, this green one represents the oculomotor nerve. So they carry through oculomotor nerve, relays in the ciliary ganglion, okay, and the postsynaptic fibers, okay, after relaying. So the postsynaptic fibers, they mainly supply the constrictor pupillae through the short ciliary nerves. So since both the Eddinga-Westphal nucleus are receiving the fibers from the right pretectal nucleus, so they send information to both the sides. So information goes to both the side, and the ciliary muscle, that is constrictor pupillae of the iris muscle, are stimulated, and there will be constriction of the pupil. So constriction is seen on both the sides. So this is the test which we do, light reflex test, whenever you are doing cranial nerve examination. So to one eye, the light is shown, so you will be seeing constriction on both the side, okay. So constriction of the pupil to which the light is shown, so that is called as direct reflex, and the constriction of the other eye where the light is not shown will be called as consensual light reflex or indirect, okay. So direct and consensual light reflex. So the constriction of the right pupil, if it occurs, so this will be the direct pupillary reflex, because the light is shown directly to this right side, but you can also see constriction on the other side. So this is called as consensual light reflex, okay. So this is due to the afferent fibers received to the both Eddinga-Westphal nucleus, okay. So which is the parasympathetic nucleus of oculomotor, which goes to the ciliary ganglion, then postsynaptic fibers travel through short ciliary nerves, which supplies the constrictor pupillae. So this is the pupillary light reflex pathway. Then it is also related to accommodation reflex pathway. So here what happens, even this is tested, you will ask the patient or ask the individual to see a object which is far off, and suddenly you will place an object near to the eye, and you will be seeing some changes in the eye. So mainly there will be inward movement of the eyeball due to the contraction of medial rectus. So whenever you place a object near to the individual eyes, so there will be inward movement of the eyeball due to the contraction of medial rectus, and there will be thickening of the lens, okay. So in order to focus on that, and along with that there will be constriction of the pupil, so in order to control the amount of light passing through that, okay. So all these reactions will be there due to accommodation reflex. So how this pathway occurs? So whenever you show an object near to the individual's eye, so what happens? So there will be pathway which travels through the optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, then goes to the lateral geniculate body, then it goes to the through the optic radiation, it goes to visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe. Okay, so from there are some connection, okay, so which passes through an eye field. So there is an eye field in the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. Okay, so there are some connection which goes to the frontal eye field. So from the visual cortex you can see the green color fibers. So some of the fibers, they are connected to the frontal eye field, which is located in the frontal lobe of cerebral hemisphere. So this will get connected to the pretectal nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So they mainly gets connected to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and also to the oculomotor nucleus. Okay, so this from here, the oculomotor nerve supplies, it stimulates the medial rectus, which is supplied by oculomotor nerve, and that's why there will be inward movement of the eyeball. So there is convergence of the eyeball due to the contraction of medial rectus, and also since Edinger-Westphal nucleus is stimulated, so again through the oculomotor nerve, the constrictor pupillae, okay, that is through the ciliary ganglion and then through short ciliary nerves, so they are stimulated and there will be constriction of the pupil. Okay, so this is accommodation reflex pathway which occurs through pretectal nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So let us move on to the clinical aspects related to the midbrain. So the damage to the arteries supplying the midbrain. So mainly the branches which supply the midbrain are coming from posterior cerebral artery. So this is a terminal branch of basilar artery. So they supply blood to the midbrain. So if there is occlusion of a branch of posterior cerebral artery which supplies the midbrain, so that leads to neurological deficit. Okay, so there are two types of syndrome, Weber's syndrome and Benedict syndrome. So before that, you have to know that midbrain actually passes through the through a gap in the tentorium cerebelli. So tentorium cerebelli is a dural fold, okay, which has a attached margin and a free margin. So this midbrain is located at the, it passes through the free margin. So whenever there is damage to the tentorial cerebelli, or if there is a forceful head movement or something, so usually the midbrain is affected, and since all these nuclei are present, mainly it contains the oculomotor nucleus, then it has trochlear nucleus, so definitely it can affect the extraocular muscles. Then it also has, very important, the substantia nigra and red nucleus, so there can be involvement of and it also has the corticospinal fibers. So so mainly the motor movement, okay, the muscular voluntary movements might be affected. Okay, so this is a syndrome called as Weber's syndrome, which is due to the occlusion of posterior cerebral artery. So this mainly affects the branch which is supplying the anterior part of the midbrain. So here you can see the lesion, the deficit over here. So it is mainly damaging the oculomotor nerve, okay, and it also damages a part of crus cerebral, okay, mainly the medial aspect and the medial 2/3. So the patient might present with, since oculomotor nerve is damaged over here, the oculomotor nerve, as I mentioned, it supplies most of the extraocular muscle except lateral rectus and superior oblique. Lateral rectus is supplied by abducens nerve and superior oblique by trochlear nerve. But the rest of the muscles, extraocular muscles, are supplied by oculomotor. So definitely the patient will have a gross paralysis of the eyeball movement. So that condition is called as ophthalmoplegia. Okay, since the crossing over, since the damage is below the crossing over, the crossing over, that is the corticonuclear fibers which are controlling the oculomotor nerve, the crossing occurs above that. Okay, since it is below the crossing, so you will be seeing ipsilateral ophthalmoplegia. So it directly supplies the same side. So definitely the patient will present with damage in the eyeball movement. Okay, so that's called as ophthalmoplegia. Along with that, as I mentioned, oculomotor also supplies levator palpebrae superioris, which mainly helps in the elevation of the upper eyelid. Okay, since that has become weakened, so the patient will have drooping of the upper eyelid. So that condition is called as ptosis. And oculomotor nerve also carries the pupillary light reflex and accommodation reflex. So when the light is shown to this part, the nerve, for example, here the left side oculomotor nerve is damaged. So if a light is shown on the left eye, there will be no constriction of the pupil, so it will be dilated and fixed to the light, and there will be absence of accommodation reflex. Okay, so this is due to the damage on the left side of the oculomotor nerve. Since crus cerebri is involved over here, so mainly occupying the medial 2/3 and medial part. Okay, so as you know, medial 2/3 part contains corticonuclear fibers and corticospinal fibers. Okay, so corticonuclear fibers are those fibers which are sending the fibers to the cranial nerve nuclei located in the pons and medulla oblongata. And you know what are the cranial nerves present in the pons and medulla oblongata. So in the pons you have trigeminal nerve, then you have abducens nerve, then in the medulla oblongata there are even the facial nerve is also seen in pons, vestibulocochlear, then below that you will have the rest 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so since corticonuclear fibers are involved, so there will be paralysis of lower part of the face and the tongue, because it is involving the facial muscles, which is mainly supplied by facial nerve and also hypoglossal nerve. Okay, so why only face and tongue? Why not the other nerve, cranial nerve? You will have this question, right? So please remember, all the cranial nerve nuclei receives corticonuclear fibers from both the sides. Okay, so if you include from 3rd to 12th, all the cranial nerve nuclei are controlled by corticonuclear fibers from both the sides. So they have fibers coming from the same side and also fibers coming from opposite side. So if one side of the corticonuclear fibers is damaged, so there won't be any effect because it is controlled from the opposite side. But except, there is an exception, except the part of the face, the facial nerve which supplies the part of the face, the lower part of the face doesn't get corticonuclear fibers from both the side, only from the opposite side. Okay, so they don't get from same side, and also the hypoglossal nerve. So again I am going to repeat, all the cranial nerve nuclei receives corticonuclear fibers from both the side, except the part of the lower part of the face supplied by facial nerve receives fibers, corticonuclear fibers, only from the opposite side, and hypoglossal nerve also receives corticonuclear fibers only from the opposite side. Okay, so that's why, since the other cranial nerve nuclei, they are receiving corticonuclear fibers from the same side. Though this is affected, corticonuclear is affected here, they are getting fibers from this side. Okay, but facial, the lower part of the face and the tongue, they get only from the contralateral side. So that's why there will be contralateral paralysis of lower part of the face. So when you check for the wrinkles, okay, so they will be intact. Okay, so this is a type of apomotor neuron lesion of the facial nerve. So since this part is damaged, and this corticonuclear fibers which is going to the facial nerve, okay, facial nerve nuclei to the lower part of the face is affected, so that's why the patient will present with contralateral paralysis of lower part of the face and also the tongue. Okay, and since corticospinal fibers are involved, so that's why the patient will have, if you can remember the vignette, there is spastic paralysis of the limbs, okay, on the contralateral side due to the involvement of corticospinal fibers. So why contralateral? Because it is above the crossing. So all these corticonuclear fibers, before they relay in the particular corresponding cranial nerve nuclei, they cross over immediately above that. Okay, so not before. So they, for example, corticospinal fibers, they cross over below the pyramids in the medulla oblongata. But corticonuclear fibers, so if there are, for example, if the corticonuclear fibers, so particular fibers supplying to the trigeminal nerve, they cross over just above the trigeminal nerve nuclei present in the pons. Okay, so they cross over above the corresponding cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, so in the Weber syndrome, these are the signs and symptoms you can see. So the vignette which showed in the beginning of the internal features, so mainly the patient might be suffering from Weber syndrome. So if you can see here, the spastic paralysis of right arm and leg, contralateral side, then right lower part of the face and tongue on the right side, there is weakness, again contralateral side, same side, left side, absence of light and accommodation reflex, then oculomotor nerve palsy. So by this you can tell the Weber syndrome is seen on the left half of the midbrain. Okay, left half of the midbrain, mainly the crus cerebri area. So here I am showing the corticonuclear fibers. Okay, so this is mainly showing the corticonuclear fibers. So as I mentioned earlier, so corticonuclear fibers to all the cranial nerve nuclei which is present in the brainstem, they are controlled from both the sides except for facial nerve and hypoglossal nerve. So I am giving an example here. So this is the area of the pons. Okay, and here you can see the facial nerve nuclei. So this facial nerve nuclei, the motor nucleus, it's divided into upper half and lower half. Okay, so the upper part and the lower part. Okay, so you can see here, this is the left side facial nerve nuclei. So to the lower part, the corticonuclear fibers, they cross over. Okay, they cross over here. So this is coming from the right side. So they, as I mentioned, they cross over just above the corresponding the fibers which has to go to the corresponding cranial nerve nuclei. So they cross over and they relay in the facial nerve nuclei. So this is for the lower part, and from there it supplies the muscles of the lower part of the face. Okay, but it doesn't get any corticonuclear fibers from the same side, so it gets only from the opposite side. But for the upper part of the face, so it receives corticonuclear fibers both from the contralateral side and also from the ipsilateral. Okay, so you can see here it is getting fibers from the right side and also from the left side. Okay, and this supplies the upper part of the face. Okay, so that's why whenever there is upper motor neuron lesion of corticonuclear fibers, so in the vignette, the damage, the deficit was in the midbrain. So here in the crus cerebri, the deficit was in the midbrain. Okay, so if the right side corticonuclear fibers are affected, so what happens? So the lower part doesn't receive any corticonuclear fibers, so there is no control over there. So, and the patient will have weakness or upper motor neuron lesion, which can be seen only on the lower part, but upper part is spared because they are receiving the fibers from the same side, because this side is not affected, only on the opposite side it is affected. So that's why in that case the corticonuclear fibers which are affected in the midbrain, the symptoms are seen on the lower part of the face, but the symptoms are not seen on the upper part because upper part of this face is spared. So similarly it happens even in the hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, so they receive corticonuclear fibers, so which you can see here. So they come over the corticonuclear fibers. So before they relay, okay, so this has to go to the the left side. So it is coming, the corticonuclear fibers are coming from the right side. Okay, so before these are concerned with the hypoglossal nucleus, so they cross over here and then they relay over here. Okay, and for this nuclei, so it comes from here, cross over and then they supply. Okay, so this is for the hypoglossal. So except hypoglossal and facial nerve, rest of the cranial nerve nuclei, they receive corticonuclear fibers from both the sides. So that's why the other cranial nerve nuclei is not affected if there is any half of the corticonuclear fibers are affected. Okay, so only you can see the difference in the whenever it is related to upper motor neuron. Okay, so for this facial, the upper motor is in the midbrain. Okay, but if the facial nerve is affected below, the entire face is affected because it is lower motor neuron lesion. Okay, so this is only seen whenever there is upper motor neuron lesion. So this difference. Okay, so we will be learning about in detail about this in my future videos on the cranial nerve nuclei. So the next syndrome is Benedict syndrome. Again, this is due to the occlusion of branch of posterior cerebral artery that supplies the midbrain. Okay, so this mainly the branch which is supplying the tegmentum part of the midbrain that might be affected. So it depends the branch which is affected. Sometimes the whole posterior cerebral artery is affected, so it will affect the whole midbrain. Okay, so if there is occlusion to the branch which is supplying the tegmentum part, so that syndrome, the neurological deficit, will be called as Benedict syndrome. So here mainly you will be seeing there is involvement of red nucleus. So since red nucleus is it is concerned with the movements. Okay, so extrapyramidal system, so the patient might present with involuntary movements of the limbs on the opposite side. Okay, so there is crossing over of this cerebrospinal tract. So that's why, so if this is involved, the patient can have, because usually the involuntary movements are mainly controlled by the basal nuclei and the extrapyramidal system. Okay, so since the red nucleus is affected on the left hand side, so the patient might present with involuntary movements on the right side. Okay, and since even the medial lemniscus, can you see here the lemniscus present on the medial aspect is the medial lemniscus. So medial lemniscus is concerned with proprioception, fine touch, 2-point discrimination. So definitely the patient might present with contralateral hemianesthesia, and also part of spinal lemniscus is also involved. So definitely the patient will present with loss of pain and temperature. So usually, so you can add on here medial lemniscus, and also part of spinal lemniscus is also involved. So the patient might have contralateral hemianesthesia, that is loss of pain, temperature, proprioception, 2-point discrimination, fine touch on the trunk and the limbs, the body and the limbs on the contralateral side. Okay, so this is how you correlate different condition with the normal anatomy knowledge. Okay, and sometimes that's what, if there is a lesion over here occupying the central gray matter, which is shown in this picture. Okay, so this also depends which nerve is involved over here. So if oculomotor nerve is involved, if the Eddinga-Westphal nucleus is involved, so depending upon the signs and symptoms are seen. But usually when the cerebral aqueduct is occluded, the patient will present with hydrocephalus. So why? Because cerebral aqueduct is the one which connects the lateral and the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. Mainly third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. So since there is aqueduct is occluded, so you know that CSF is mainly secreted in the lateral ventricle and third ventricle. So CSF gets accumulated over there because it is not passing through the fourth ventricle, because from fourth ventricle it goes to the subarachnoid space where the absorption takes place through arachnoid villi. So since there is no movement of CSF and it is getting accumulated in the lateral ventricle and third ventricle, so definitely there will be enlargement of the ventricles, and that leads to a condition called as hydrocephalus, which is the main sign and symptom in the condition. Okay, so that completes the third part of the brain stem neuroanatomy. So again, my reference is from Clinical Neuroanatomy by Snell, and also the picture I have taken from the Google Images. So that completes the external and internal features of midbrain. Thank you for watching.